This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
So, hello everyone. Welcome to the second panel of the second day of the RECET Festival this year about migration and transformation. This is a panel about migrant literature as transnational literature, or migrant literature and transnational literature in women's fiction. And I'm very happy to have on the podium three excellent speakers who I'm going to introduce without much further ado. My name is Zsófia Lóránd. I'm working here at the university at the Department of Contemporary History, and I work with RECET as well. And maybe just this background about me, that now I'm a historian, but I'm also a trained literary scholar, and I worked in publishing for many, many years. So this is my youth and my past, which is coming back now on the stage. And today with Éva Cserháti and Petra Bakos, we even have some shared histories in this field. I will start the introduction maybe from my right with Tamara, PhD candidate at the Department of Gender Studies and Central European University in Vienna. And she is a researcher engaged with the project EUTERPE, European Literatures and Gender from a Transnational Perspective. Her areas of interest are transnational and women's feminist literary theory, migration, language, post-Yugoslav region, and the Balkans. Next to her is Petra Bakos, who is an interdisciplinary literary scholar, arts writer, and embodied writing facilitator. Her academic research focuses on the Southeast European borderlands and the floating debris of empires and other state formations in the tsunami of market-driven populism. Currently, she is the scientific coordinator of the same project in which Tamara is involved, called EUTERPE, again, European Literatures and Gender from a Transnational Perspective. It's an MSCA European project, and Petra is also an affiliate at the CEU's Roman Studies program. And absolutely, last absolutely not least, is Éva Cserháti on the stage, who is a British-Hungarian writer and literary translator. She has 3 master's degrees in Hungarian language and literature, Spanish language and literature, and critical gender studies. She writes upmarket crime fiction, and in her writing, her aim is to give voice to the silenced her story of women during state socialism and to explore how they have been affected by the transition. And her work heavily speaks to the theoretical fields that Petra and Tamara explore. And I would like to add that we ended up with this strange imbalance on the stage. The initial plan was to have 2 writers and 2 theoreticians. I will try to moderate the discussion in a way that we have a bit more space, or an equal amount of space for the literary expertise of practice and the theoretical. We are going to be exploring these topics of what is the transnational, what is migrant, how these relate to each other, what does this mean for literature, which is a heavily transnational issue, especially because of the language, because we all are trained, nation states train the population heavily embeddedly in the national context, and it's often explained through the fact how heavily language is important for literature. There is a proverb by a Hungarian poet that poetry will always remain the private matter of nations because of the difficulty / according to this poet, impossibility to translate. To question this and to challenge this, you work one way or the other with the concept of the transnational, or you practice the transnational. All 4 of us live in a country which is not our home country originally. So we not only work with these concepts, but we experience it. And I would like to invite the 3 of you to share it about how these concepts are there in your expertise, what these mean to you, And after this personal round, we will become a bit more theoretical, and then we will become more political, and it's going to be very exciting. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I can start if you're going to do it. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Zsófia, for having us, for inviting us to this festival. If I understand correctly, you want us first to say a bit about our personal reasons why we're dealing with transnational literature.
And how you yourself work with transnational literature.
Okay. Okay. I will start then with with my personal story. So my background is in comparative literature and in gender studies, but I've spent a couple of years working in an NGO in Serbia, engaged with migration issues in general. So I used to work with refugees from the Middle East, from Africa, with former refugees from Yugoslav spaces in multicultural communities in Serbia, and so on. It was a personal and professional engagement, I must say. And then when I decided to get back to literature, somehow I couldn't go further without this concept of transnational literature, because I couldn't go further thinking about literature without thinking about the effects that nation states have on people's lives. And then I started to be interested in these fictions that are thematizing migration, that are talking about not only transnational encounters, but they're talking about experiences of people who are not only migrants, but also deprived of their communities, maybe. How being an asylum seeker or being deprived of your basic human rights is thematized in literature, and and are there any political effects of it? So maybe, yeah, that's one of the reasons. And how do I use transnational? Like, when you read about transnational literature, there are these debates like whether transnational literature is an approach or is it a type of, whether it's a type of literature. And I would say it is both. So it can be your approach towards literature in a way that you want to overcome methodological nationalism, in a way that, for example, in my research, I'm dealing with the authors who are the authors that migrant authors from different countries, from, let's say, generally the Balkans or post-Yugoslav countries, and Albania, but who work and write in Italy or in Germany or in Austria. So in that way, I'm trying to find some connections between those authors that are crossing national borders, but also in terms of a specific type of literature, in a way that all of these authors are thematizing migrant experiences and privileges or disprivileges of this sort of life. So that's it from me for the beginning. Thank you.
Okay. So I work mainly on borderlands literature, and these borderlands being the South Pannonian borderlands. So the southeastern borders of the EU. So I read authors who would be nationally classified as Hungarian, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. But I primarily read them as borderlands authors, because what unifies these authors is what interests me. So not what separates them and puts them in individual nationalistic boxes, but what unifies them, and it's usually a fluency in multiple languages, or if not in multiple languages, at least in multiple cultural codes. The hearing, a kind of hearing that is readily open to perceive the presence of hybridity, of intermingling, of métissage in culture, in language, in practices, in religion. And I'm looking at these authors, and by looking at them and claiming that borderlands literature is part of transnational literature, and right, the understanding of transnational literature as migrant literature, which was present in our title, not as a claim, but exactly as a problem. So for many who work on transnational literature, it's sort of a prerequisite to claim the transnationalness of an author, that the author has some sort of immigrant background or diasporic background,
What I'm claiming is that transnationality is rather a lens, and one can have that lens without geographic movement. So these people who live in the borderlands very often have transnational lens without ever leaving their birthplace. I'm also claiming that many of the transnational scholarship is sort of blind to these regions, but national scholarships are also blind to these regions, because to work on these regions, you need to often talk multiple small languages. And just to have a word about like how I arrived here. So I myself grew up in Vojvodina, which is now part of Serbia. And on my mother's, I'm partly Croatian, partly Hungarian. But because my parents' marriage was very patriarchal, I ended up practicing my Hungarianness more than my Croatianness. Nevertheless, I could always feel a closeness to cultures and people and communities who are without the proper national flag or any other symbols. And growing up and then becoming a literary scholar and then the gender scholar, I noticed how these people are basically missing from the charts in literary studies and in other research as well. So this is, of course, part of the drives. But then later on, I recognized that this borderlands perspective beautifully fits with the transnational perspective. And I think we will have later chance to discuss why this transnational perspective is important, especially today.
So, hello everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's great. I'm a crime writer, so I always gather material for the next book. So, watch your back. That's the only thing I can say. When I had to say a biography on myself, I said I'm British-Hungarian, which is true and not true, but sounds cooler. And that's why I said than just saying I'm Hungarian. I have British citizenship and I migrated. I call myself a sentimental immigrant because I married in the UK, never had any plans to leave there. But I really fought against becoming, Britanized, and my mom saying I've been westernized in a bad way, meaning I adhere to rules and being overly polite and all those things. But I tried not to be that, although I'm very attracted to the British culture and I have citizenship there, I can put it in the biography, I'm a British Hungarian author. But it's a much more complex relationship, obviously. So my background is literary translation, so I always laid it with many languages. And but I translated a lot into Spanish and from Hungarian fiction into Spanish, which is very weird because you generally translate into your mother tongue. But there are not many Spaniards who said, I'm going to learn Hungarian just to become a translator. So we generally translate from our language and we work with a native speaker. So that was my first crossing the borders, let's say, of a different style when you start producing literary text in another language. And for a long time, when I went to live into the UK and I lived part-time there, I just said, I'm never going to learn English so well to be able to translate into English. It was defending my Hungarianness. And that has changed. I do self-translation now, and maybe is the next project going to be a little bit writing my books in Hungarian, but then not only translating it, but writing a version of it in English. So I don't know if that counts as transnational. It does. That's why I'm here.
You raised a lot of, I think, very important points already in your introductions. We will definitely go back to these questions of language and nationalism, proper flags, improper flags. But I also wanted to add to Eva, to your story, that you, out of your books, it really deals with with the issue of migration, being outside contexts. Like in the first book, it's a bunch of women from different countries on various boats on the Aegean Sea, supporting each other. You worked on Greek migrant children who ended up in socialist Hungary, coming from the Greek Civil War. And your last book is about people from the international brigades who go to support the Spanish cause in Spain, and there is a strong Hungarian English connection there. So you work a lot, not only between languages, but you also work with this question of migration, home. And I was thinking to share this, that I organized a big literary festival in Hungary on German funding, of course, with writers from all over the world who were all successful writers working in a different context from their own native one. And it was a huge hit with the nationalist media, and the title on the festival was Home. And the nationalist media picked up on this immediately, that these people cannot have the faintest idea of what is home if they don't work where they come from, without even noticing that one of them was the Transylvanian author Sándor Kanyadi, who ended up working in Hungary. So they were even just defeating their own discourse through this. And I haven't quite prepared you for this question, but how does this question of home and belonging figure in your research, or whatever you are willing to share in any other?
Rima the first sound. Because I totally forgot to a transnational and personalized about my career and not so much about my books. But I remember that festival Zsófia organized 12 years ago, was that, or even more? So it was about home, and that was the time I came back from the Mediterranean. I lived 5 years on a sailing boat, and northwestern part of the Mediterranean. That really makes you very transnational. And so my first book is about that. And I went back and I went to this festival, Home Hazaheim, the title in 3 languages. And I wrote my first piece on a topic. It goes through all my work. It's what is belonging in one's home when you don't live in the country where you were born. So what happens then? What happens with your characters and what the identity say about home? And so I work on these multi-generational stories because I love lost children and children who is brought up in another culture. And what happens if you can't go home and you have to cope in another environment, and then suddenly you're allowed to go home, as it was the case of this Greek children. So for me, the belonging is an ongoing question, as much in my life as in the things I write about. And I think belonging is an evergreen in literature. And it's works great in crime fiction because crime fiction works on the base of mystery. Now it doesn't matter if it's the whodunit, who killed whom, but the motive of the behind it, it's many times a sentimental thing about family, about belonging, and I like that type of crime. So although I do like psychopaths and serial killers, I read those, but I like stories with family issues behind them. And I think we are all murderers. I think it's in us. We just try not to cross the line most of the time. If we are lucky, we don't. So it was a great last sentence. I leave it there. Let me try to pick up there with murder. I will end up with murder. So okay, belonging and home. Now I just realized that finally it seems I'm over the time when this question jerked gears out of me, so I can talk about this in a calmer manner. So the country I was born in and that I somehow, the child, was able to identify with doesn't exist anymore. It was Yugoslavia. And then throughout the 90s, being part of double minority was a very contested period when belonging was basically super localized to the circles of maybe family or the hosted. And then later I lived in the United States for a while for
sentimental reasons. I married a guy from there. And I returned to start my PhD at the Central European University, which was in Budapest, which itself became a migrant university in the meantime because the populist government of Hungary ousted the university from Budapest. But beforehand, I had a few good years there. And after like 20 years, I felt a true sense of belonging because at CEU, there was Eastern Europe and the States and all of it together, and all the languages I speak and all the cultures I relate to, and an understanding that we are in same pickle, which unfortunately is, I wouldn't say gone now from the portfolio of the university, but definitely their forced migration to Vienna changed the character of the university in many ways. So basically, when CEU moved away from Budapest, I moved away from Budapest, and I moved home. What I call home is Vojvodina. And what I feel, or I have a sense of belonging with, is actually the land. It's oftentimes missing from discourses about diaspora, discourses about transnational literature, our connection to land. We talk a lot about identity, language, cultural factors, but then there is a very sense of belonging with a particular land, a particular landscape, the flora, the the sunset and all that. So recently, if someone asks me where do I belong, it's so where I live is right next to the river Kisa, and then there's a sign, Kisa 123. So meaning that's like the 123rd kilometer of the river, and that's my address on this planet now. And I feel good. I feel I do belong with that. So the murder part comes in where I'd like to, in my research, which shifted a lot since I moved back, I'm trying to bring in more and more this element of how we, yes, live together with other cultures, other languages, religions, but ultimately how we live together with this otherness as we perceive our natural environment.
Okay, I had some time to think about this, but it is a rather difficult question. So, like in terms of some geographies, I don't think I have ever felt any sort of like being at home, especially because every member of my family was born in a different city. I always felt like a stranger in every city where I lived. Um, During the war in Yugoslavia, suddenly members of my family became people who live in a different country, even though nobody moved, or they moved. Some of them were refugees. So in that sense, I think like the physical location was never part of my sense of belonging, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in migrant literature, that you find your belonging elsewhere. And now when I was thinking about it, I think my true belonging it is in the language. Actually, that what I perceive as my native language, Serbo-Croatian or ECS, is my true home. And even now, and when I mean, I used to, as Petra, I used to live in Budapest before we were kicked out from there. And now I'm here in Vienna, where there is a huge Yugoslav community living here. That also feels like home. But there was this very interesting moment when one of my colleagues from EUTERPE project interviewed me, and I wasn't aware of my answer, but later it showed up in the like printed version of the, not printed, but some version of the interview. And then she asked me like, where is the home? And I said, home is where my books are and where my knowledge is archived. And I was completely unaware of this. But then I realized, okay, so my books are at my parents' home and at my home here. So that is probably my version of belonging and home, belonging to a certain language, maybe.
Thank you. Can I add just a short one to yours? So in this festival Zsófia did 30 years ago, somebody quoted Thomas Mann, who said that my home is where my library is. Do you remember that? It was Christina Toth was quoting him.
Sorry, it was Thomas Mann, not me.
So what I'm just saying, it's just so funny it comes back to me.
Thank you so much for sharing this much about your personal stories. And I think that you shared also, what you shared makes bring this conversation further and actually very much relates to literature itself, because you all talked about language and books. It, I think, is interesting how, on the one hand, literature is in, embedded into language, and in a way, it involves a geographical belonging or even rootedness. And at the very same time, there is a literary canon, at least the Western literary canon, which is shared, and we quote Thomas Mann. Or I always say, when it comes to the transnational in literature, I think of the recently passed away writer from family Yugoslavia, Dubravka, literature as her home and as the location of herself and her writings. At the same time, I often feel a very privileged concept, this kind of transnationality of literature and this shared canon, and it's a very white and male, not only Western, but very white and very male canon. Whereas, so where are women in this canon, and how would you tackle this issue of like a dominant concept of the transnational and your research and your experience, which is very different from that?
May I? Okay. So thank you. I'm really glad that you mentioned this question and that you mentioned the Western canon and gender within all of this, because, yeah, so the case studies that I'm researching on are the case of female writers writing about migration, writing about these questions that we mentioned, belonging, not belonging. These are usually people who write in the dominant language, so they're not writing in their native language. For example, Anilda Ibrahimi or Ornella Vorzi are Albanian authors from Albania who are writing in Italian. Ibrahimi lives in Italy, Vorzi lives in France and writes in Italian. They problematize a lot of these questions with it. So their characters are migrants, they're thinking about belonging, about home, but they're also thinking about their belonging within language and within literature and within the canon. Because what all of my examples that I'm dealing with in my research are not only about migration, but also some form of rewrite of the classical novels, usually of the male authors. So I will give you one or two examples. You probably know, like the audience from Vienna probably know about Barbie Markovic's novel, Going Out, Izloženje. This is a novel remix, so it's a rewrite of the other Thomas Bernard novella. So she intervened. It is a failed translation, right? So she intervened in the text and created a new work of art. Something similar is doing Anilda Ibrahimi with Flaubert. So she's writing a contemporary version of Madame Bovary, the one who has an Albanian lover and then travels from Italy to Albania with him. And I was trying to trace these signs, like how these male authors, these dominant literary texts are entering the works of these migrant authors. And then I was wondering, okay, so these are the ways in which, firstly, women and then migrants are searching their way to enter the canon by these connections with the established literature. And I think that is a very interesting question, like what is considered a literature worthy of reading. And we had this conversation before, like this morning, when we were talking about like what gets to be translated or what gets to be published and how it looks like. And none of my case studies are translated into English. Like some of them are translated into, I don't know, Serbo-Croatian or German, but not into English. And I think this is a excellent opportunity so that we start discussing also about these hierarchies that are functioning and what can we do about it. So, yeah.
Just go ahead. I'm trying not to play too much with the microphone.
Okay, so I think it's time to offer a bit of an overview on this project, which I'm the scientific coordinator of, and within which Tamara, the PhD student, works. because I think the purpose of this project is exactly to give to respond to these problems that you raised, Zsófia, about the whiteness and male-centeredness and middle-class centeredness of much of literary studies. So our project actually, UKRI, is coordinated by the Central European University here in Vienna, but 7 other universities are part of the project. 2 Spanish, 1 Polish university, 2 universities from Britain, and the Bologna University. And the scholars who are working from each research center are themselves of transnational backgrounds. So, and then we had 11 PhD students, among them Tamara, who work on gender and transnational literature in the work of women-identified writers in Europe. And the output, or what we envisioned as the crown of this project, will be a 2-volume publication. The first volume of which will have about 50 concepts, which are, in our view, meaning in the view of this consortium, relevant for transnational literature, such as migration, diaspora, post-socialism, traveling concepts, genre, sexuality, race, class, case, which I might be pronouncing wrong. So about 50 concepts will comprise the first volume, and these concept entries are written by scholars from mainly from European universities. And then the second volume will be report the dictionary, so it will contain biocritical entries, index essays about the work of transnational women-identified European authors. And Tamara wrote several of these entries, and our other students are also writing entries for this volume. And yes, the language of these publications will be English, but we are doing our very best to not be overwhelmed by authors who write in English or who are translated into English. So we use the capacity of our consortium and read into other European languages, and we want authors to be represented who are not yet translated into English because of, they are maybe not considered marketable enough, or the problems of their country are not trendy enough, or for the usual reasons. So this is the project we are working on. And yes, this whole project tries to be a response to what Zsófia raised at this issue. So it's an intersectional project at its core. And I hope that eventually we'll be able to present the volumes here as well.
Yeah, may I just quickly add something, and then we can continue. So what we are trying to do basically is that we are trying to intervene in the canon and to put a spotlight somewhere else. Because even when you read about transnational literature and how these famous authors are defining transnational literature, it is always about, they say, well, it is discovering of these remote places that were not in focus before, like, for example, Africa or Bosnia. And then you're like, remote from what? And what does that even mean? And why Africa? As if it is somewhere on Mars. We recently came back from England, and then I'm like, I can also say that it is on a remote island from everyone. So yeah, even within these conceptualizations of transnational literature, there are some very problematic definitions. And what we are trying to challenge here is that, as Janetta said in the previous panel, like, we're trying, you can easily end up in Orientalism by dealing with these literatures. Like, you can easily end up in Orientalism when you talk about Bosnian War, Hungary. I don't know. I think what we are trying to do is to challenge these discourses and also to intervene in the canon. And maybe, why not, maybe these works can be translated into English. But if not, maybe we can, I don't know, learn some more languages in order to read them.
I've been thinking about that, and when we talked this morning, what translationism means for me, and for what hand it's who I am as a writer, what are the topics I write about. I don't think there is any story which can be national, and especially the kind of stories I write, which is about contemporary Hungarian society. obviously I'm always bringing in different stories because there is no one historical period which stands on its own in the same between the same borders. But there is also another thing how book market works, because the way book market works is the way sweet market works or oil market works. I mean, we tend to think about literature, this wonderful thing, and art, which is beyond us. But at the end of the day, as you know, it's about money. Or you get granted, or you get money for it, or you don't. And the European book market is heavily, especially in crime fiction, heavily biased from the UK and the US, because that's a lingua franca. Now it's easily read. They have an agency system, so you can compare how translational literature happens. So I think book market is a totally different story, and just listening to you how to intervene into the canon, and I just could see book market laughing at the back and thinking, oh yeah. And I got a very interesting question this morning where we told that they said, oh, you write crime fiction travelers. And it's true to a certain degree, because many of us like reading a story which has a mystery, the cool murder. So there is a cliche what we write as different readers. One of them like reading the same all the time. The serial killer comes, it's bloody or it's not bloody. And there are the other readers who like drawing for historical crime or female detectives. So there is a lot of subgenres. But it doesn't travel at all. So what we buy, it's mainly UK and US and the Scandinavian, the so-called Scandinavian, which was a wonderful marketing and branding thing. What they did, they are selling it perfectly well. And when I started to write, I was sold the Hungarian Scandinavian writer, whatever that means. I don't know. It was because I put some social issues into the book. That's what the Scandinavians do. And the first one I wrote was a serial killer one because I just loved them. So I think when we talk about transnational literature and what moves it, what is behind, it's quite a lot of different factors.
Thank you for this. And maybe I would take us back for another 5 minutes, and slowly we can open the floor for discussion. I would go back to this tension or connection between the concepts of migration and transnational literature. And I was talking to a couple of colleagues preparing this panel. One of them suggested that actually transnational is a euphemism for migrant literature. Someone else said, no, because transnational is such a theoretical concept, it's a highbrow concept, whereas migration is cool. Of course, this is very context dependent, right? So if you go to a German Frankfurt book fair where you have the Bildungsbürgertum getting educated, then migrant is cool. If you are in Eastern Europe, then it's not. And then at the same time, transnational is clearly much more than a euphemism or fancier or more complicated term for migration, because this whole issue of diasporas, but also communities on borderlands are part of this. And then there is this more highbrow approach that Thomas Mann is transnational. So how important is migration, and what else is important?
So what we are doing in this project that I just described, so as I said, there will be about 100 entries about the work of transnationally posited authors. What I didn't say is that we don't have a preliminary concept of what transnational means. So what we are trying to do is harvest data, use a fancy idiom of the day. So we would like to discover what transnationalism is, how it appears, how it functions, what forms it takes in their work. So instead of coming from above with a cookie cutter, we want to see how people who position themselves in some way or another transnationally write. What are the common elements, narrative bits, genres, maybe symbols, synonyms, all of that runs in literature. And therefore, at this moment, I don't have a working definition of transnationalism, because we really try to keep this open as long as possible. So in a sense, we are using a decolonial methodology. So we are not coming from above. We are trying to learn through our authors, through their novels. And importantly, again, we are not applying theory on novels, but we take these novels and poetry and works of drama or essays as sources of thought. So we turn that lens as well. And I'm saying this because just to offer context to what I say next will be more of a response to what Zsófia asked, which is how migration factors in here. And actually, yes, in the positioning of the author, to the self-positioning of the authors, migration can factor in great ways. If they are coming from a migrant background or 1.5 generation migrants or so on. At the same time, just being from a migrant background doesn't necessarily mean that one would write or think or see the world transnationally. One can be very much tied to certain national concepts or national symbology, and despite being the migrant. So this is not about individual biographies. It's really more about perspective, system of values, and narratives. And yes, many of these narratives factor in migration, but that's not exclusive to them.
Yeah, I also don't think that it would be a good practice that we try to define what transnational literature is, as I said at the beginning, so it can be considered an approach or type of literature, and we can debate about it. But I can say that, if we're doing research, then we should think about whether this concept gives something to me or it doesn't. So I think in my research, this transnational approach gives something to me as a way to unite all of these different writers across borders, across ages maybe, and then how I how I see them as transnational is because their work puts a challenge to a nation state in a way that these characters are people who are asylum seekers. They're waiting in a line. They're crossing borders illegally. They are marginalized within these new communities. So all of these things and the effects of nation state and the challenge to it is a part of the plot. So in that way, I find the transnational concept useful for my research, but it can be something completely different in somebody else's case.
Thank you. And Eva, I actually I'm sure you have something already to say, but I wanted to direct you a bit with this question or with this whole issue of how transnationalism is a positive concept in terms of challenging a national framework, and then the English language. And you, as a writer, working partly in the British context, knowing a lot about the British and English language book market, and how, on the one hand, we value the transnational, how, on the other hand, it's difficult when you write from a different context and you bring in names that sound strange. And how is the reaction to that? And what are the ways to cope? Or I will leave it here.
So first of all, I wrote a lot in promoting Hungarian literature in Spain. So I learned how to sell the Hungarian brand, which first they only wanted monarchy, the Hungarian monarchy, and they only wanted after that only communism. That was the two words they wanted to hear about, and if the book was none of that, then that was not interesting. But the Spanish market is fairly open market. When I tried to find an agent in the UK, that was a big challenge, and I didn't find one at the end. Because they said that I self-translated my first crime fiction, and they said, oh, it's very interesting, it's very good, but could I just change the names? The names of Hungarian names are very complicated to read for the British, because they're in another language, and that's a challenge. And they weren't in French or German or maybe Scandi. So, and I got very upset about that. I even wrote a short story about it. I wasn't kidding that agent in the short story, but that's to come. But then I re-edited my translation, and I have to say that I decided, okay, I'm not going to British personalized names, but I put easy names and some kind of surnames which would recall something for the British reader, that instead of having Turkey nudge, it was just Turkey. So this kind of. But I drew a line, it was without an H at the end. That was, I can feel that I am giving in. And the last book I write in Hungarian, but increasingly I spend a lot of time in the UK. Obviously, I work in the UK. And so sometimes words early in the morning, they come to me in English. And I used to be extremely ashamed about that. But I decided like a year ago, then, you know what? I'm going to look up in the dictionary when it comes to me in English. So I open a dictionary and it's actually enriched my writing because I got a so much closer relationship with my Hungarian. And it just happened to be the same that when I had to translate Hungarian fiction into Spanish, then I really had to understand the Hungarian text because it just more or less understand what we are saying. But when we went to have to do it in another way. So it's a very complex question about how languages enrich each other, or is it a loss? For a long time, I thought it was a loss, that I would lose my fantastic Hungarian. But now I look at it, and I wanted to connect to this, the landscape thing. Yes, that languages are just like plants. You have to take care of them and water them. And some of them, one of them grows better and the other one less, and depending on which part of your life you are in it. And I want to write once about that. So obviously I can say funny stories about the book market and the narrow-mindedness of the book markets, but it is a bit pointless. So we just have to reach out and read other literatures.
Thank you so much.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.